Welcome, everyone, and my name is Matthew Schmaltz. I'm a professor of religious studies at the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts. And I'm also founding editor of the Journal of Global Catholicism, which is part of the Catholics and Cultures initiative of the McFarland Center in Religion, Ethics, and Culture at the College of the Holy Cross. And it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Petra Kuivala, assistant professor of global Christianity at the University of Eastern Finland, and who is also presently conducting research as a visiting fellow at Harvard University in the fields of history, theology, and religious studies, as well as Cuban studies. She received her doctorate from the University of Helsinki in 2019 and worked as a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Helsinki. She has also held an appointment as a Fulbright visiting scholar at the Cuban Research Institute, Florida International University. Besides her focus on religion and the Cuban Revolution, Dr. Kuivala's broader research interests include Christianity in the Americas, contemporary Catholicism, and the questions of Catholicism and political power. So welcome.
Thank you.
And to begin with, could you please share something of your intellectual journey, why you study what you study and why you do what you do?
Sure, I'd be happy to. The roots of my intellectual journey are in Finland. I was intellectually raised at the Faculty of Theology at the University of Helsinki. And I was very happy and proud to work with fantastic scholars of church history, global Christianity, global theologies, and contemporary Catholicism. So from that mix emerged my interest in contemporary modern Catholicism, especially in Latin America.
And what particularly within Latin American Catholicism do you find compelling intellectually? What kinds of questions does it raise?
So I work specifically on Cuba, and Cuba after the revolution of 1959. And of course, with that come the questions of Christianity, Catholicism, and socialism, communism. It's an important part of my roots also that in Finland, there is a long-standing, strong tradition of studying Christianity and socialism, especially in Eastern Europe. So having been raised academically in that environment, it has been very natural for me to then direct my interest in Cuba along these same frameworks, studying Cuban society and the way religion has interacted and still continues to do with socialist state order and Cuban society as it has been constructing socialism.
Yeah, very interesting. And could you talk a little more about the intersections between religious life and political life, or revolutionary lifestyles, if you will, in the Cuban experience?
Sure. So Cuba has been a predominantly Catholic country prior to the revolution of 1959, and I would argue that also after the revolution. In the research on the Cuban Revolution, one predominant paradigm has been to assume a religious disappearance, naturally following socialism as the prevailing social order. And then in my research, I focus on the ways in which religion, Catholicism in particular, has been present in Cuba, and in fact intertwining and overlapping also with the revolutionary culture and revolutionary lifestyles, not always through institutions, but more through people and their everyday lives.
So can you talk more about that and give some specific examples?
Sure. One of the things I've been interested in the past couple of years has been Catholic material culture and the way that has overlapped with the material cultures created by the revolution and the Cuban government to support socialism. And I've been studying material Catholicism as one of the ways that has allowed Cuban Catholics to not only preserve, but also to express their religious beliefs and orientations and worldviews and practices within a society that has officially denied them their public role and visibility as believers.
So would this involve Catholics, for example, who are also pro-revolution?
Sure. In the first couple of years, up until the socialist turn that took place in 1961, the Catholic and revolutionary cultures were actually mutually inclusive. The new Cuban government, led by Fidel Castro, actually employed Catholic material culture as one of the elements they used to legitimize their power and gain popular support. And then at the same time, large numbers of Catholics supported the revolution and also took part in the revolutionary fight that led to Fidel Castro coming to power. The problems in the relationship emerged only after the socialist turn, in which religion became an undesired element of Cuban society.
What was it about the socialist turn that made religion an undesirable element?
Well, of course, it was a gradual process that started before the official turn in 1961. One of the things about the Catholic Church and Catholicism that was problematic for a nationalistic revolution was its nature as a transnational global religious movement, in which people did not follow national borders in their obedience to a higher authority, be that God or the Pope.
Right.
And that, of course, was problematic for the nationalistic narrative built on the Cuban Revolution as a people's movement on the island resisting exterior forces.
Okay, so would it be fair to say, and please correct me, after the socialist turn, that the use of material culture within Catholicism became more associated with acts of resistance, or not?
I think it would be very fair to say. In fact, in my work, I argue that it became one of the primary channels or media through which Catholics were able to portray resistance in their worldviews and beliefs through very domestic and intimate acts of religious behavior. For instance, when Cuba became socialist and religion was visibly removed from society through nationalization of convents and Catholic hospitals and the closure of Catholic schools and seizure of Catholic media, I argue that one of the transformations that took place was the shift from these very public institutional forms of Catholic presence to small domestic forms of individual belonging and ways to express identity. And material culture played a key role in it, in things like refusing to remove sacred objects and religious items from private households, even though that led to public stigmatization in the neighborhoods, or collapsing social status and social relationships as well.
Can you talk about a particular, you mentioned material images in homes. Can you talk about a particular material image or artifact that was impregnated with this kind of meaning?
Well, in Cuba, the most well-known would be, of course, the effigy of La Virgen de la Caridad del Cobre, Cuba's patron saint. She's been a symbol of the Cuban nation long before the revolution and throughout the revolution. And I argue that she and her material representations are one of the long-standing currents that have persisted in Cuban households that show us how much of the old Cuba actually survived into the new. Although in scholarship, we've been pretty keen to claim that the revolution was a domain of change that produced a new order. And I think material Catholicism is one of the things that shows us how much of the old actually continued to exist within the new.
Excellent. Fascinating. Now, as you well know, there's a lot of discussion about how to theorize materiality and whether or not objects have their own agency and so forth. I mean, when you talk about material Catholic culture, what kind of theories or ways of conceptualizing it have been most helpful for you?
I think this relates to a broader question in Cuban studies, which is the access to primary sources.
Yeah,
Most of the archives in Cuba dating to post-1959 period are still closed.
really.
Um, um, uh, I'm the first scholar who gained access to the Catholic archives dating to the revolution, and the same has been true for most of state archives. So there's still a lot of written sources that we haven't been able to access until very recently or at all. So material culture provides us one of the windows into theoreticizing history through new sources and through access of information. For me, the primary connection I've made has been from material culture to lived religion,
Mm,
because archives as a state of historical production also reflect a sort of institutional and institutionalized historiography, and the tendency in Cuban studies in the recent years has been to ask what sort of other histories of the revolution exist beyond the institutional sphere. So for me, material Catholicism has allowed me to tap into the lived experience of Cuban Catholics, and lived religion as a theoretical framework has been very important for me in that matter.
looking, you're also a scholar of global Catholicism, not just Catholicism in Cuba. And so when you look at the broad sweep of contemporary Catholicism as an academic, what particular themes or issues strike you as being particularly important?
One of the things I'm looking forward to very much is all the exciting work that I know is done currently on Vatican II,
Mm,
revisiting Vatican II as a global event, not from the perspectives, not necessarily from the perspectives of centralized power, but from the peripheries, from the multiplicity of Catholic cultures and expressions, and what Vatican II looks like when it's seen through those lenses, be those the laity, religious orders, women, or specific countries and cultures that may have not been treated as the protagonists of Vatican II until recently.
mm. And in what particular um, places, shall we say, or spots on the periphery, would you say are particularly interesting when we think about the impact of Vatican II?
Well, from my perspective on Cuba,
Yeah,
I'm very interested in the way Vatican II was received and interpreted in Cuba, because a lot of the time we think about Vatican II in Latin America uh, in a continuum with liberation theology and the
right.
very strong social consciousness and awareness, uh, while it took a slightly different trajectory in Cuba. And I think these are necessary stories that would help us complicate the narratives on what Vatican II was and how it was received in different continents and cultures.
What would be the legacy of Vatican II, would you say, among those who emigrated to the United States after the revolution? And when you look comparatively at lived forms of Catholicism, say, among the Cuban community in Florida, vis-a-vis in Havana, let's say, what kind of differences would you see?
Well, it's one of the interesting things is that the broad ways of migration from Cuba to the United States took place in the same years with Vatican II.
Right.
In Cuba, it's often thought that the council arrived a little later. It wasn't until the late 70s, early 80s that the council was implemented. So in that sense, it also proved to be a source of renewal, um, not only in social consciousness, but also in diplomacy with the Cuban government.
Mm.
And of course, the question of the Catholic Church collaborating with the Cuban government has been a source of controversy for the Cuban exile community in the United States and continues to be.
Yes, yes, it certainly does. And at least at every election cycle, we hear a lot of talk about that since the news particularly identifies the Cuban community as a powerful political constituency and so forth. Tell us about your future work plans and how you see your research developing.
Thank you. I'm currently working on Cuba continue to do so. And I'm actually working on a project that intends to place Cuba as a Catholic country on the broader map of global Catholicism through Vatican II, through liberation theology, through migration, to see how Cuba relates to the rest of the Catholic Latin America, how it differs from other Latin American Catholic countries in the 60s, in the 70s, in the wake of Vatican II and liberation theology, and how this reflects on the Catholic Church on the island.
And so how does it differ?
Well, like I mentioned, the Cuban trajectory has been different from other Latin American countries. And I think it's fair to say that at times the Cuban church has experienced a sense of alienation from other Latin American churches, partly because of the political and social conditions on the island, and also partly because of theological differences. And it's been important for Cuba to maintain a working relationship with the Holy See, because the Holy See has been instrumental in negotiations with the Cuban government then to guarantee and to expand the space the church occupies in Cuban society.
Okay.
So I think there is an interesting power dynamics there.
Fascinating. Well, Petra, Kuivala, thank you so much for joining us today, and with best wishes for your research. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.